Hey guys, this is the nerd with a silly name, Poohead189, and today I'm giving you a traveler's guide to Warhammer Fantasy. Essentially, it's a basic overview. Now, first things first, before we dive into the lore, we need to ask, what is Warhammer Fantasy? Well, the term Warhammer, meaning as a franchise made by Games Workshop, is thrown around a lot. But Warhammer can mean three different things. It could mean Warhammer Fantasy, which is the one we'll be talking about, which was the first tabletop war game they released back in 1983. It could mean Warhammer 40k, which is the science fiction or science fantasy version of Warhammer Fantasy, released 4 years later in 1987. Or it could mean Warhammer Age of Sigmar, which is the sequel to Warhammer Fantasy, though I use the term sequel lightly. That was released in 2015. Now, Warhammer Fantasy, originally Warhammer Fantasy Battle, is somewhat difficult to pin down in a description. Imagine taking a pot and throwing in Tolkien, Robert E. Howard, Michael Moorcock, maybe even some H.P. Lovecraft, and our real-world Earth in the 16th century, with more than a dash of parody and dark comedy, and you'll have some idea of what it is. The whole idea of Warhammer Fantasy is that everything in the setting exists as a 16th century German peasant might think of the world, except not only is this real, but it's mixed with Tolkien, or at least the Tolkien-esque tropes. The forests are dark and foreboding, filled with monsters and cultists. The cities are corrupt. The east is mystical and pagan. The new world is horrific wilderness. The north is grim and perilous. And the southern continents are either filled with desert bandits or jungles of poisonous things and lizard men. Now, Warhammer 40k always gets the reputation for being grim-dark. However, Warhammer Fantasy invented the term. The world is constantly in danger of being overrun by demons, humanity is constantly beset on all sides by enemies both mundane and otherworldly, and humanity's allies are either in the same position or worse. However, I don't want to make it seem like humanity is united. There are various human nations that fill up the Warhammer world, as well as, like I said earlier, the Tolkien-esque races. But before we get to the factions, let's talk about how the Warhammer world began in the lore. And while this video is for beginners, let's remember that while the information I'm going to provide will be good for a role-playing perspective, not many people in the Warhammer world would really know how the world began, so just keep that in mind. Now, the Warhammer world has no name. It is simply called the Warhammer world, or the world. It looks like a bastardized version of our own world, with a few slight differences, as you can see on the screen. Not very creative, but it's not supposed to be. They used it as a playground to build stories, and it works. However, the world was not always shaped this way. About 20,000 years before the current year, the Warhammer world looked far different. The planet was a frozen wasteland, perpetually winter across the entire world other than the equator, where huge beasts fought one another for the limited resources the land could contain. It was this chaotic state the Old Ones found the planet in. Now, if you're a fan of 40k, you know who the Old Ones are. They showed up in Fantasy first, but they're talked about far more in the 40k setting. The Old Ones are an ancient, powerful, highly advanced race of reptilian aliens that cultivate life. They arrived, and though we do not know if they landed on spaceships or some other means, we do know they made 2 warp gates at the poles of the world. Now, these warp gates were massive structures that led to destinations we do not know, but they allowed for instantaneous teleportation. These are super important later on, so keep them in mind. Now, what the Old Ones did first was move the planet closer to the solar system's star, so the planet began to warm up from its frigid temperature. After that, the Old Ones then created all of the races we know and love. Elves, dwarves, humans, but first they made the Lizardmen. Now, the Lizardmen were the primary helpers, workers, and warriors for the Old Ones on the planet. The Old Ones took the native lizards that had managed to survive in the equator and genetically engineered them to grow larger and more humanoid, making various castes of Lizardmen for different roles. Now, while the Lizardmen are not quite robots, they aren't quite natural either in their biology or way of thinking. They are quasi-sentient, and were made to be obedient, strong, and intelligent. I won't delve too deeply into them yet, but they were the purpose-built helpers of the Old Ones and the oldest sentient race on the planet. Then, the elves, dwarves, and finally men were made, as well as various others like giants and the like. The orcs simply appeared one day, and though the lizardmen Saurus warriors killed many of them, they could not exterminate them. Their extermination was ordered because of what the lizardmen call the Great Plan. You see, the Old Ones had a purpose for the Warhammer world, but after their disappearance, we don't know what that is. However, the orcs were not a part of it, and so the lizardmen set out to genocide them. Unfortunately, it did not stick. Speaking of the disappearance of the Old Ones, let's talk about it. After they changed the climate, moved the continents around, and created the races, something happened. Something cataclysmic. The warp gates that they created at the beginning broke. Now, we need to do a brief overview of chaos. So if you know anything about Warhammer 40k, you're pretty familiar with the term, but let me break it down very quick. There is an alternate reality, sort of a mirror reality to our own, made of energy that is formed from all of the emotions and actions of our reality. It is where all magic comes from. It is also the place where demons and the dark gods live. Now, in order to safely use magic in the Warhammer world, it needs to be purified in some way. But it's very easy to fail at that and burst into flames or be controlled and possessed by a demon. Now, pure chaos is extremely dangerous and damning, and when the warp gates were destroyed, what filtered into the world was pure chaos magic, likely because the instantaneous teleportation used the warp, or where chaos resides, as a way to sort of bend space and time. Now, it led to vast swathes of the planet being changed and corrupted by chaos, and endless hordes of demons invaded the world. So essentially what happened after that was dinosaurs versus demons. Yeah, you can't think of anything more badass than that. And I mean literal dinosaurs too. The lizardmen ride them into battle and use them as beasts of burden in war. However, while the lizardmen fought the most, the dwarves and elves helped too. The dwarves protected the mountains as best they could, and the elves tried to stem the tide of demons as well. But don't forget, it was not just demons that invaded, but the very stuff of chaos. Animals, plants, the very ground was warped. Goats fused with trees, the soil bled like a split belly, the mountains laughed. However, while the dwarves followed and learned from their gods deep in the earth, and yes, their gods walked among them then, and the lizardmen fought the demons across the globe, the elves devised a ritual on their island of Ulthuan that trapped their greatest mages in a maelstrom of magical energies, and it worked. The maelstrom, generally called the vortex, became a sort of drain on chaos magic. And though the chaos energies could not be totally wiped out from the world, the excess energies were sucked into the vortex, and to this day it still keeps the world from being plunged back into chaos. Once the dust settled, the Old Ones were gone. We don't know where they went. They were either destroyed by chaos when the gates broke, or they fled, never to return. The lizardmen, though still a great power, were now decimated and left to 2 continents in the south. It was now the time of the elder races, meaning the elves and the dwarves. Now, there were other powerful peoples in the world, of course. The ogres and giants were once advanced civilizations, and the orcs never left and teemed in hordes. But it was the elves and dwarves that were the biggest civilizations for thousands of years, until a huge war called the War of Vengeance, which was a global conflict between the elves and the dwarves that sundered both of their empires, and led the way for men to flourish. Now, the earliest human civilization was called Nehekara, and it looked much like our real-world ancient Egypt, but after that, other human civilizations rose and fell, until the modern era where we find ourselves. And while I have made more detailed histories, and might do so again, I believe you now have some idea of the Warhammer world and its origins. Now, let's talk factions. So, Warhammer Fantasy, though it now has a lot of great novels and is the setting for really successful video games like Vermintide 1 and 2, Mordheim, Total War Warhammer, it was originally a board game for war games, where you set up models that you painted to fight via a point system. So each faction was made with the intention to fight on a battle map, or to be used in connection to such a purpose. I will also only be doing general overviews to give you their flavor. I've already done dedicated faction videos for the dwarves, the Empire of Man, the orcs and goblins, and the vampires, and I plan on doing all of them at some point. Anyway, let's get to them and start with the Empire of Man. Also called simply the Empire, is generally considered the main faction of the setting. It is essentially the fantasy equivalent of the Holy Roman Empire. They use German names, they have Gothic architecture and German style and accents, they have an emperor that is elected by elector counts, each presiding over a province. They use sword, spears, halberds, bows, early guns with black powder weaponry, along with state-sanctioned magicians from universities. The Empire is a place ripe for intrigue, warfare, cultists, monsters, any sort of plot you can think of. Every province is unique and over the top, and the drip the characters have is amazing. Oh, also the Empire has a handful of gods they worship, but the main religion is the cult of Sigmar, which worships the first emperor of the Empire of Man, Sigmar Heldenhammer. It's sort of like a cross between Catholicism and Norse paganism. Also, living in the Empire are halflings. They're exactly what you expect, except more extreme. They are very short, they eat a lot, they cook a lot, they steal a lot, they are very greedy and lustful. They live in a sub-province called the Mootland. Okay, next is Kislev. Now, Kislev is the human nation that resides just north of the Empire. Think of Kislev as the fantasy version of the 15th to 16th century Eastern Europe, particularly Russia. They have the Russian accents, they drink vodka, they use ice magic, they love bears, even worship a bear god called Urson. They're tough and are famous for their light cavalry. Out of the non-chaos factions of men, they live closest to the Northern Chaos Wastes, which is the only warp gate that has direct access to the various continents. The Empire often helps out Kislev in times of war, because if Kislev fails, the Empire will be attacked by Chaos next. Now to the west and south of the Empire is Bretonnia. This is a nation of men that have yet to leave the Middle Ages, and in fact, they choose to be that way. They do not use black powder weaponry, there is barely a middle class, they oppress their peasants heavily, and their main fighting force is their knights. To that effect, their knights might not be as well armored as the Empire's knightly orders, but Bretonnian knights tend to be better based on skill, breeding, and many of them are bolstered by magic. They follow the Lady of the Lake, who holds the Grail, and yes, like the Holy Grail. And so to the surprise of no one, Bretonnia is like medieval France mixed with the myth of King Arthur. Next we have Araby. I know what you're thinking, and yes, this is literally Fantasy Arabia. It has all the tropes you can think of. Sorcerers, sultans, genies, flying carpets, mounds of gold, pirates, bandits, camels, elephants, and ancient undead curses. Love Araby. Now we have Astalia and Tilia, or Tilea. Both are super colorful and fun. Astalia is the fantastical Renaissance version of Spain, and Tilea is the counterpart to Italy. They have city-states, intrigues, pike and shot warfare, mercenaries, explorers, and great accents. Next to them are the Border Princes. Now, the Border Princes don't really have a historical counterpart, though some do claim it's the Balkans, but I don't believe that is ever stated. It's a hodgepodge of barons, princes, and exiles that look to find a home and carve out a piece of land for themselves, rife with a lot of conflict. Next, we have the lands of the East, Cathay, Ind, and Nippon. Now, as you can probably tell, Games Workshop was not really creative when it came to certain names, but the factions are still fun. Cathay is high fantasy China, though rumor has it it's ruled by a vampire. Nippon is fantasy Japan during the Sengoku Jidai, or the Warring States period. And Ind is fantasy India, filled with ancient temples, elephants, 1,000 gods, and tiger beastmen. And now, while there are a few more minor human factions, let's go to the non-human ones. I have already described the lizardmen in some detail, however we should note they still worship the old ones as gods. They hope they come back one day, really. They live in temple cities with Aztec and Mayan aesthetics, they wield bronze, bone, and obsidian weaponry, and their Slan mage priests are the strongest magic users in the world. Also, lizardmen can live forever unless they are killed, and they spawn out of spawning pools fully formed and ready to work, not needing to be taught. They live in Lustria, the equivalent of South America, and in the Southlands, the equivalent of Africa. After that, we get the dwarves. So, as you might have noticed, Warhammer takes tropes and turns them up. These dwarves are like any fantasy dwarves, just dwarfier. They are grim, they love gold, they forge, they have long beards, they never forget or forgive, They are short but strong and supremely tough. They live in the mountains, particularly the World's Edge Mountains, and they can brew the best alcohol in the world. Some of it is so good, you can drink it and live off of it rather than needing to eat. They worship the ancestor gods of their people. The dwarves live for hundreds of years, and they are very good engineers too. The dwarves also have another subrace, called the Chaos Dwarves. They hate one another. In fact, if you ask the dwarves about the Chaos Dwarves, sometimes they'll pretend they don't exist. The Chaos Dwarves were the ones that were caught out in the open when the chaos magic from the broken warp gates swept over the world, and they changed them and made them into misshapen, cursed things. Next we have the Skaven, a race of furred rat men that live underground all across the world, all over the Warhammer world. They are infused by chaos, they are cruel, they are vindictive, they backstab one another constantly. They are also essentially the setting's biggest example of comedy, as they are hilarious to read and write about. Skaven are surprisingly advanced technologically, and they also have quite powerful magic, but Skaven are not very valuable to anyone else or even to themselves. Skaven die by the thousands just to kill one dwarf, one elf, one man, one orc. You'll normally find them fighting subterranean battles, but they have invaded the surface before, and for some reason in the Empire, they are considered myths. Well, okay, it's not exactly just for some warped reason. The reason is because the Imperial citizenry would sort of freak out if they knew that rat men lived constantly under them and could surface at any moment and invade their towns or cities or steal their children. So that is one reason why their existence is either not believed in or kept a state secret. But Skaven are really fun and a really great Warhammer faction. After that are the Tomb Kings. I mentioned Nehekara earlier. The Tomb Kings are essentially the long-dead denizens of Nehekara that have stayed alive through various ancient sorceries. Well, not technically alive, they are undead, but they have survived or existed for thousands upon thousands of years. Now, the Tomb Kings are not like regular undead, because you can't just raise them again and again. The Tomb Kings and their soldiers are limited. They are limited to the numbers that were in Nehekara when it fell. However, they are still an extremely powerful faction with huge war machines, ancient magics, and they have this creepy and cool aesthetic. Next are the vampires, or vampire counts, which technically live across the old world, or the world in general, but generally they live in Sylvania, which is a sub-province, used to be a province all of its own, in the Empire. The vampires are what you might expect. They are blood drinkers that live forever, and they cannot go out in the sunlight. I did make a dedicated video on them earlier, but think of them as your typical aristocratic vampire lords. Next are the elves. Now the elves have three subraces. High elves that live on Ulthuan, the equivalent to Atlantis, with huge gleaming towers of silver. The wood elves that live in Athol Loren between Bretonnia and the Empire, a huge forest filled with pixies and monstrous walking trees. And then the dark elves, who live on Nagaroth, the Warhammer equivalent of North America, a grim, chilly land of beasts and towering forests. The High Elves are sophisticated, tall, well-ordered, with high magic, and they ride eagles and dragons into battle. The Wood Elves are cunning, guerrilla fighters, druids, almost eldritch beings who are tied to the land they protect. The Dark Elves are cruel slavers, torturers, beast tamers, sailors, and deadly warriors who want nothing more than to kill the High Elves. Elves live a supremely long time, are supremely arrogant, and supremely pointy-eared. Following that, we have the Orcs and the Goblins, also called Greenskins. I made a dedicated video on them fairly recently, like late last year, but they are, as noted, green of skin. The Orcs are huge, muscled, barbaric, they love a good fight, and can't help but charge. The Goblins are smaller, cunning, conniving, and cruel. They are literally the same as Warhammer 40k Orcs and Greenskins, in fact. Greenskins live all over the Warhammer world, but their main homeland is the Badlands, between the Western world and the Eastern world, and below the dwarves in the World's Edge Mountains. Now we have the Ogres. Now, Ogres used to be highly sophisticated and intelligent, actually, but they devolved after centuries, and now worship a god of eternal hunger called the Great Maw. The Ogres are modeled after the medieval idea of the Mongols, and they live in the Mountains of Morn, east of the World's Edge Mountains and the Badlands, but west of the Eastern nations. They are 10 feet tall, girthy, and their culture revolves around violence, greed, and especially gluttony. An ogre is always hungry. Sometimes ogre mercenaries leave and can be paid by other nations to fight, as long as they get enough money for food. Finally, we have Chaos. Now, Chaos has a few armies and factions under their belt. First is Norska, the fantasy equivalent of Scandinavia, with berserker Vikings and pagan magic. Next are the Beastmen, who loathe humanity, and they are essentially the Roman idea of barbarians at the gate. They want nothing but destruction. They were created when the warp gates fell and chaos magic fused man and beast together in some unholy union. Next are the hordes of chaos themselves. You see, north of Norska and Kislev is the Chaos Wastes. There is one in the South Pole, but you don't hear of that one much because it's blocked off by the sea. In the Chaos Wastes, mutants, corrupted men, twisted monsters, and demons live in a land of pure insanity, and each of them fight for one of the four main chaos gods. Nurgle, god of disease and pestilence, Khorne, god of blood and battle, Tzeentch, god of change and plots, and Slaanesh, god of unspeakable pleasures. Each vie for power with their armies, and truth be told, the Chaos Wastes are limitless, as they simply flow into another reality. However, every once in a while, the Chaos Gods unite their armies and march south, and attack the Warhammer world, usually the Old World, and the Old World being what would be the Warhammer equivalent of Europe, in monumental hordes of monstrosities. Usually they are led by an Everchosen, or a Chaos follower that is blessed by all four gods. This is generally a world-threatening event. Chaos is never to be taken lightly. Whew, okay guys, I think that about wraps up the basic overview for the day. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe if you think I deserve it. If you have any questions, please comment below, and I hope you all have a great one. Alright, see you!